When King Aelle threw Ragnar Lothbrok into a pit of venomous snakes, he thought he had ended the Viking threat. He had no idea he had just signed his own death warrant for the most horrific execution in medieval history, the Blood Eagle ritual. This isn't just a story about revenge. This is about how one act of cruelty unleashed the most savage justice medieval Europe had ever witnessed. The year was 867 AD, and Ragnar Lothbrok had made a fatal miscalculation. After decades of terrorizing England with raids that brought him legendary status, the aging Viking king had attempted one final conquest of Northumbria. But this time, his famous luck had run out. King Aelle of Northumbria had been waiting for this moment his entire reign. The Christian king who had spent years cowering behind his fortress walls while Vikings burned his countryside, finally had the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok in chains. Aelle's court advisors recommended a quick execution, kill the legend and be done with it. But the Northumbrian king had other plans. Ragnar stood in Aelle's great hall, wrists bound but spirit unbroken. His long blonde braided hair, now streaked with gray, fell across shoulders that had carried the weight of 1,000 battles. Those piercing ice-blue eyes that had struck terror into kingdoms showed no fear, only the calm acceptance of a warrior who had always known this day would come. "You think killing me ends this?" Ragnar spoke, his voice carrying across the stone hall with eerie confidence. "You have no idea what you're about to unleash." But Aelle wasn't interested in warnings from a pagan prisoner. He had prepared something special, a death that would match the suffering Ragnar had brought to his people. What King Aelle didn't understand was that he wasn't just executing a Viking raider. He was murdering the father of the most dangerous warriors in Scandinavia. And in Viking culture, there was only one response to the murder of a father: Blood Eagle. Warriors, if you want to witness the most brutal revenge in medieval history, strike that red shield. Join the Great Heathen Army and see how Ragnar's sons delivered justice that made kingdoms tremble. The execution pit had been carved deep into the Northumbrian bedrock. Dozens of venomous snakes writhed in the darkness below, adders whose bite brought agonizing death within hours. Ragnar was lowered into the pit as Aelle's court watched from above. The Christian nobles expected screaming, begging, perhaps the breakdown of the legendary Vikings' courage. Instead, they heard singing, as serpents struck again and again, as venom coursed through his veins. Ragnar Lothbrok sang the death song of his forefathers. His voice, strong despite the poison, carried ancient Norse verses that spoke of Valhalla, of warriors' deaths, of sons who would avenge their father's murder. The piglets would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffered. Ragnar's voice echoed from the pit, each word a promise. "But my sons will not grunt, they will roar." King Aelle laughed at what he thought were the delirious ravings of a dying man. He had no idea he had just heard his own death sentence. When Ragnar's voice finally fell silent, Aelle declared a feast. The great threat was ended. The Vikings would retreat to their frozen homeland, leaderless and broken. But across the North Sea, in the halls of Denmark and Norway, Ragnar's sons were about to receive news that would change the course of medieval history. The message arrived on a storm-battered longship, carried by one of Ragnar's retainers who had witnessed the execution. In the great halls of Kattegat, Uppsala, and York, 4 names would echo with promise of vengeance: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Ubba. These weren't ordinary Viking raiders. These were Ragnar's blood, trained in warfare since childhood, each a legend in his own right. The brothers met in Uppsala's sacred temple before the altars of their gods. With blood-covered hands placed on ancient swords, they swore the most terrible oath in Viking culture. Their father's death would be avenged with the Blood Eagle. King Aelle would die in a manner so brutal that his screams would echo across England for generations. Within months, the largest Viking army in history began assembling on the Danish coasts. This wasn't a raid for treasure. This was a war of extermination launched by sons seeking their father's revenge. Ivar the Boneless, despite his physical limitations, possessed a tactical mind that could outthink entire kingdoms. Bjorn Ironside commanded the kind of personal loyalty that made warriors follow him into certain death. Hvitserk brought berserker fury that terrorized enemies, while Ubbi provided the strategic planning that turned rage into victory. The fleet that sailed for England in 865 AD was unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. Over 3,000 longships carrying more than 10,000 warriors, each sworn to one purpose: making King Aelle pay for Ragnar's murder. This wasn't conquest for territory or treasure. This was justice, Viking style. When the Great Heathen Army landed on English shores, it brought terror unlike anything Christian kingdoms had experienced. Town after town fell with barely a fight as word spread. Ragnar's sons had come for revenge. The brothers didn't want quick victory. They wanted King Aelle to know they were coming, to feel the fear building, to understand that his death would be neither quick nor merciful. Kingdom after kingdom fell to the Great Heathen Army's systematic advance. East Anglia, Mercia, and parts of Wessex all submitted rather than face the wrath of Ragnar's sons, but Northumbria remained. King Aelle had fortified his kingdom, believing his walls could protect him from Viking justice. He would learn otherwise. When the Great Heathen Army surrounded Aelle's capital, they didn't attack immediately. Instead, they sent a message. "The sons of Ragnar have come. Deliver the snake killer, and your people will live. Refuse, and watch your kingdom burn before your eyes." Aelle's response was predictable: defiance backed by prayers to a god who had already proven inadequate against Viking fury. The assault on Aelle's fortress was a masterpiece of Viking warfare. Ivar's tactical genius, combined with Bjorn's fearless leadership and the army's berserker fury, overwhelmed defenses that should have held for months. But the brothers weren't interested in a glorious battle. They wanted Aelle alive. When King Aelle was dragged before Ragnar's sons, the Christian king who had once tortured a father now faced those children's terrible justice. Gone was the arrogant ruler who had laughed at a dying Viking's prophecies. In his place stood a terrified man who finally understood what he had unleashed. Ivar the Boneless spoke for his brothers, his voice carrying the cold promise of inevitable death. "You threw our father into snakes and listened to him sing his death song. Now you will sing yours, but your tune will be very different." Aelle begged for mercy, offered treasures, promised tributes. The brothers listened in silence, then sentenced him to the Blood Eagle, the most brutal execution their culture could imagine. The Blood Eagle wasn't just an execution. It was a sacred ritual dedicated to Odin, designed to send the victim's screams to Valhalla while ensuring their souls suffered eternal torment. Aelle would be bound face down while his ribs were cut from his spine and spread like wings. His lungs would be pulled through the opening and draped over his wings while he remained conscious. If he screamed during the ritual, his soul would be denied entry to any afterlife. As the ritual began, Aelle's torment exceeded anything recorded in medieval chronicles. The methodical precision with which Ragnar's sons carried out their father's revenge demonstrated that this wasn't random cruelty. This was justice, Viking style. The man who had tortured their father with snakes now experienced agony that made his victim's death seem merciful in comparison. The details of King Aelle's Blood Eagle execution were so brutal that Christian chroniclers refused to record them fully. What they did document was this: the man who had killed Ragnar Lothbrok died in agony so complete that his screams could be heard across the entire city. But Aelle didn't scream immediately. For the first cuts, he held his silence, perhaps hoping to preserve his soul for the Christian afterlife. When the brothers pulled his lungs through his rib cage and spread them like bloody wings, King Aelle's resolve finally shattered. His screams echoed across Northumbria, carrying news of Viking justice to every corner of his dying kingdom. According to Viking belief, those screams condemned his soul to eternal wandering, denied entry to any afterlife by his failure to die with dignity. As King Aelle drew his final breath, Ragnar's sons had fulfilled their oath. Their father's death was avenged in a manner so brutal it would be remembered for centuries. The Blood Eagle had served its purpose. demonstrating that killing a Viking father brought consequences more terrible than death itself. News of Aelle's execution spread across medieval Europe like wildfire. The Blood Eagle wasn't just revenge. It was psychological warfare designed to terrorize anyone who might consider harming Vikings. The message was clear: touch our families and experience agony beyond human imagination. With their king dead and their capital conquered, Northumbria surrendered completely to the Great Heathen Army. But the brothers weren't finished. They had made England pay for their father's murder, but the lesson needed to be permanent. They would establish Viking rule across northern England, ensuring that Ragnar's legacy lived forever. The story of King Aelle's Blood Eagle execution became the most feared tale in medieval Europe. Kings who had never seen a Viking learned to fear the consequences of harming Ragnar's people. The Blood Eagle had evolved from execution method to psychological weapon that protected Vikings across the known world. Ragnar's sons had achieved something unprecedented. They had avenged their father's death in a manner so complete that it established their own legendary status. The Great Heathen Army controlled much of England, and the Blood Eagle had become synonymous with inevitable Viking justice. Their father's death song had been answered with screams that echoed across Europe. The Blood Eagle execution became the ultimate deterrent in Viking culture. Enemies learned that killing Vikings brought consequences worse than death. It brought artistic torture designed to destroy both body and soul. This wasn't random brutality. This was justice elevated to religious ritual. Medieval chroniclers wrote that the Blood Eagle was so terrible it should never be performed again, but they also recorded that the mere threat of such execution prevented countless conflicts. Who would risk such agony for political gain? Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, and Ubba had established themselves as legends through their father's revenge. The Blood Eagle had proven that Viking justice was more terrible than any enemy's cruelty. They had transformed their father's death from defeat into the foundation of eternal terror. The Blood Eagle transcended simple execution to become the ultimate psychological weapon. Medieval enemies learned to negotiate rather than fight, to surrender rather than risk capture, to fear Vikings more than death itself. Ragnar's sons had weaponized their father's murder into eternal tactical advantage. In the great hall that had once been King Aelle's, Ragnar's sons celebrated their father's revenge. They feasted as warriors who had delivered justice so complete it changed the rules of medieval warfare. The Blood Eagle had elevated their father's death from tragedy to triumph. From the screams of King Aelle emerged a truth that would echo through centuries. Viking justice was more terrible than Viking warfare. The Blood Eagle had proven that some crimes demanded punishment beyond simple death. Ragnar Lothbrok's murder had been avenged in a manner so brutal it became legend, so complete it changed history, so terrible it protected Vikings for generations. In the great hall of Valhalla, even the gods acknowledged the perfect justice of the Blood Eagle. Ragnar's sons had honored their father's death with revenge that would make enemies tremble for centuries. The old boar's piglets had indeed roared, and their roar would echo through eternity.